The iron lacework catches the afternoon light on Royal Street, casting delicate shadows across weathered brick that has stood for nearly 2 centuries. Number 1140 Royal Street rises 3 stories above the French Quarter's narrow sidewalks, its elegant galleries overlooking the steady stream of tourists who pause beneath its ornate balconies, cameras raised, guidebooks open. The mansion is beautiful in that particular New Orleans way, where European grandeur meets Caribbean flair, where every decorative flourish whispers of wealth and refined taste. But step closer to those wrought iron gates, and locals will tell you something feels wrong here. The air grows heavier. The temperature drops just slightly. Some claim they hear things at night, sounds that have no source, no explanation. This is the LaLaurie Mansion, and it holds within its walls one of the darkest chapters in American history. What happened here in the spring of 1834? What horrors unfolded behind the elegant facade of New Orleans' most beautiful home, within the most prestigious address in the French Quarter? The answer would shock a city that thought it had seen everything, that would send an enraged mob pouring through these very doors, that would force the woman who lived here to flee for her life, while her name became forever synonymous with unspeakable cruelty. On an April morning in 1834, smoke began curling from the mansion's kitchen. What started as whispers of fire became flames that drew neighbors and volunteers rushing to save the grand house. But what they discovered when they broke through a locked attic door would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The fire revealed secrets that Madame Delphine LaLaurie had kept hidden behind locked doors and pleasant smiles, behind charity galas and society balls. The witnesses who climbed those stairs that day emerged, changed, some unable to speak of what they had seen, others talking of nothing else. Delphine LaLaurie was no outsider, no stranger lurking at society's margins. She was New Orleans' aristocracy, a woman who hosted the city's elite in her ballroom, whose grace and beauty were remarked upon in drawing rooms across the French Quarter. And that is perhaps what makes this story so deeply unsettling. Evil did not announce itself here. It wore silk and pearls. It spoke French and smiled at all the right moments. This is not just another ghost story whispered on moonlit tours. This account is built on historical records, witness testimonies, and documentation that survives to this day. What you are about to hear goes deeper than legend, darker than folklore, stranger than any fiction could dare to be. In the sweltering heat of 1825, when New Orleans pulsed with the exotic rhythms of 3 cultures mingling in uneasy harmony, Delphine McCarty entered the world already wrapped in silk and privilege. Born into one of the city's most distinguished Creole families, she arrived with advantages that most could only dream of possessing. Her father, Louis Barthélemy McCarty, held the position of territorial judge and moved through the upper echelons of Louisiana society with the ease of inherited power. The McCarty name opened doors throughout the French Quarter, and young Delphine learned early how to glide through those doorways with practiced grace. The Creole aristocracy of New Orleans existed as a world unto itself, a delicate ecosystem of bloodlines and breeding, where Spanish land grants mingled with French refinement and just enough American ambition to create something entirely unique. These were families who could trace their lineage back to the earliest European settlers, who spoke French in their parlors and Spanish in their counting houses, who measured wealth not merely in currency, but in the number of servants who attended them and the quality of wine that graced their tables. Into this rarefied atmosphere, Delphine McCarty bloomed like an orchid in a hothouse, cultivated and admired. Her education followed the pattern expected of young women of her station. She learned to speak perfect French and passable Spanish. She studied music until her fingers danced across piano keys with mechanical precision. She mastered the art of needlework, though she would never need to mend her own clothes. Most importantly, she absorbed the unspoken lessons that mattered most in her world. How to enter a room so that all eyes turned toward her. How to smile in a way that promised nothing while suggesting everything. How to wield charm like a weapon and social standing like a shield. By the time she reached marriageable age, Delphine had perfected the performance of aristocratic womanhood. Her first marriage came when she was barely more than a child herself, united with Don Ramon de Lopez y Angulo, a high-ranking Spanish officer. The union brought prestige, and cemented alliances between prominent families, which was precisely its purpose. But Don Ramon died suddenly at the royal court of Spain in 1804, leaving young Delphine a widow before she had truly been a wife. She returned to New Orleans draped in expensive mourning clothes, her tragedy only adding to her mystique. Her second marriage to Jean Blanc, a prominent banker and merchant, proved more substantial. Blanc possessed both wealth and influence, and together they moved through New Orleans society like royalty surveying their domain. She bore him 4 children, fulfilling her duty to provide heirs while maintaining the appearance of domestic contentment. But when Blanc died in 1816, Delphine found herself a widow once more, now with considerable wealth at her disposal and the experience to wield it effectively. It was her third marriage that would define her legacy, though not in the way she imagined on that wedding day in 1825. Dr. Leonard Louis Nicolas LaLaurie arrived in New Orleans from France, a physician of some reputation and considerably younger than his bride. For Delphine, now in her 30s and twice widowed, this marriage represented something different. LaLaurie brought respectability without overshadowing her, a distinguished name without domineering authority. He seemed content to let his wife shine, to play the role of devoted husband while she orchestrated their social ascension. And ascend they did. By the early 1830s, Madame LaLaurie had established herself as the unquestioned jewel of French Quarter society. Invitations to her gatherings became the most coveted prizes among the aristocracy. Young women studied her mannerisms, hoping to capture some fragment of her poise. Men found excuses to linger in her presence, drawn by beauty that seemed only to deepen with age, and a sharp intelligence that made her company genuinely engaging. She moved through the social landscape like a chess master, always several moves ahead, cultivating alliances and collecting admirers with calculated precision. But ambition requires a stage worthy of the performance. In 1831, construction began on what would become the crown jewel of Royal Street, a mansion designed to announce the LaLaurie prominence to all who passed. The location itself spoke volumes. Royal Street formed the very heart of the French Quarter, where the finest families maintained their residences and where every facade competed for architectural supremacy. The LaLaurie Mansion would rise 3 stories high at the corner of Royal and Governor Nichols Street, its elegant galleries overlooking the narrow streets where vendors hawked their wares and ladies took their evening promenades. Construction took more than a year, and throughout 1831 and 1832, neighbors watched the mansion take shape. Local craftsmen labored alongside enslaved workers to create something extraordinary. The exterior presented a masterpiece of restraint and elegance, gray stucco walls rising to support elaborate wrought iron balconies that seemed to float in the humid air. These galleries, decorated with intricate scrollwork and delicate railings, became the mansion's signature feature, visible from blocks away and instantly recognizable as a symbol of refined taste. Inside, no expense was spared. The rooms flowed one into another with graceful proportion, their high ceilings drawing the eye upward to elaborate plasterwork and crystal chandeliers imported from France. Marble mantels framed fireplaces in every major room. The floors gleamed with polished cypress and heart pine, covered in places with Turkish carpets that had traveled across oceans to rest beneath the feet of New Orleans aristocracy. Silk wallpaper in subtle patterns covered the walls. The furniture represented the finest examples of French craftsmanship, each piece selected by Madame LaLaurie herself during careful consultations with merchants and dealers. When the mansion opened its doors for the first grand reception in late 1832, all of New Orleans society clamored for admission. Those fortunate enough to receive invitations arrived in their finest carriages, stepping down onto Royal Street to pass through doors that opened into a world of carefully orchestrated splendor. Candlelight glittered off crystal and silver. Musicians played from a discreet corner, their melodies floating through rooms filled with the city's most prominent citizens. Enslaved servants moved silently among the guests, offering champagne and delicacies on silver trays, their presence so constant as to become nearly invisible to those they served. Madame LaLaurie presided over these gatherings like a queen holding court. She wore gowns created by the finest dressmakers, fabrics that whispered when she moved, and jewelry that caught the light with every gesture. Her dark hair was arranged in elaborate styles that took her enslaved ladies hours to perfect. Her smile never faltered, her conversation never lagged. She remembered names and family connections, inquired after children and business ventures, offered sympathy for losses and congratulations for triumphs. Guests left her presence feeling seen and valued, already anticipating their next invitation. The parties became legendary. Seasonal balls that lasted until dawn. Intimate dinners for the city's power brokers where fortunes were discussed over brandy and cigars. Garden parties where ladies in pastel dresses strolled among carefully tended roses while servants stood ready with fans to provide relief from the heat. Every event reinforced the same message, that the LaLaurie Mansion represented the pinnacle of refinement, and Madame LaLaurie herself embodied grace and sophistication in their highest forms. But beneath the polished surface, tiny cracks began to appear for those observant enough to notice. In 1833, barely a year after the mansion's completion, a young enslaved girl died under circumstances that neighbors found difficult to explain away. The official story proved vague and unsatisfying. An accident, some said. An illness, others claimed. But those who lived nearby remembered seeing the girl just days before, and whispered among themselves about the speed of her decline. The funeral happened quickly and quietly without the usual rituals, and questions that might have been asked in other households fell silent in the face of the LaLaurie prominence. Around the same time, others who lived on Royal Street began to hear things. Strange sounds drifting from the LaLaurie Mansion at odd hours. Sometimes late at night when the parties had ended and the guests had departed, when the street lay quiet beneath the moon. Sounds that might have been nothing, or might have been something, depending on who listened and what they chose to believe. A cry quickly stifled. The rattle of chains from the upper floors. Footsteps moving hurriedly where no one should have been walking. At first, neighbors dismissed these disturbances. Old houses made strange noises. The wind played tricks. The imagination ran wild in the small hours of the morning, when darkness and silence amplified every sound. And besides, who would dare suggest that anything untoward occurred in the home of Madame LaLaurie, the woman who represented everything admirable about their society? The very idea seemed absurd. Yet the whispers persisted and slowly grew. Enslaved people who served in nearby households began to share stories, speaking in low voices when their masters could not hear. They talked about the LaLaurie slaves, about how thin they had become, how they moved with downcast eyes and never spoke unless spoken to. About how some who entered that mansion were never seen again, sold off perhaps, though no one could say exactly when or to whom. These stories circulated through the invisible networks that connected the enslaved community, creating a parallel narrative that existed just beneath the surface of polite society. Some neighbors noticed other peculiarities. The LaLaurie slaves rarely appeared in public, unlike servants in other grand households who might be sent on errands or accompany their mistresses on social calls. When they did venture out, they seemed anxious to complete their tasks and return. A few claimed to have glimpsed unusual punishments through windows left carelessly uncurtained, though these witnesses often proved reluctant to provide details or repeat their stories to authorities who might have investigated. The contrast between public performance and private reality grew starker for those willing to see it. In her parlor, Madame LaLaurie spoke eloquently about duty and civilization, about the responsibilities that came with privilege and position. She donated generously to charitable causes. She attended Mass with appropriate devotion. She embodied every virtue that her society claimed to value. But behind the closed doors of her mansion, something else was unfolding, something that would eventually transform her name from a symbol of refinement into a byword for horror. For now, though, in these early years of the 1830s, the darkness remained mostly hidden. The parties continued. The invitations kept arriving. Madame LaLaurie's reputation for beauty and grace only grew more secure. Those who harbored doubts kept them private, unwilling to challenge someone so firmly entrenched in the upper reaches of society. The magnificent mansion on Royal Street stood as testament to everything the Creole aristocracy aspired to be, its elegant galleries and glittering windows presenting a facade of perfection to the world outside. And in the shadows behind that facade, horrors were being born that would eventually shatter the illusion and reveal the terrible truth that privilege and refinement could mask the darkest of souls. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the slate tiles of the Royal Street Mansion that spring day in 1833. Neighbors going about their daily routines in the French Quarter heard something that made them stop in their tracks. A scream, high-pitched and desperate, pierced through the usual sounds of the city. Not the theatrical cry of a street vendor or the playful shriek of children at play. This was the sound of pure terror, the kind that makes the blood run cold and demands attention. What happened next would become seared into the memories of everyone who witnessed it, a tableau of horror played out against the bright blue Louisiana sky, where no shadows could hide the truth. Those who looked up saw a young girl scrambling across the steep mansard roof of the LaLaurie Mansion. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old, perhaps as young as 8. Accounts would later vary. Her name was Leah, or Leah, as some records would note. She was one of the enslaved children who served inside the grand home of Dr. Louis LaLaurie and his wife, the elegant Madame Delphine LaLaurie. The child's bare feet struggled for purchase on the slate tiles that had grown slick from the afternoon heat. Her simple cotton shift billowed in the breeze as she crawled, stumbled, and clawed her way toward the cupola at the roof's peak. But she was not alone. Behind her, moving with frightening determination, came Madame LaLaurie herself, the woman who hosted the most refined soirees in New Orleans, who charmed diplomats and merchants with her wit and grace, was now wielding a cowhide whip. Her fine silk dress, likely worth more than most working men earned in a year, seemed grotesquely out of place in this pursuit. Her face, usually composed in the perfect mask of aristocratic beauty, was twisted with rage. She cracked the whip through the air, the sound sharp as gunfire echoing between the buildings. Witnesses later testified that they stood frozen, unable to process what their eyes were showing them. Jean-Louis Montreuil, a carpenter who lived across the street, would tell authorities that he thought at first he must be seeing things, that perhaps the heat had addled his mind. But then his wife grabbed his arm and pointed, confirming the nightmare unfolding above them. Other neighbors emerged from their homes and courtyards, drawn by the commotion. They gathered in the street, their faces turned upward, watching in mounting horror. The young girl reached the cupola, and for a brief moment seemed to hesitate. She looked back at her pursuer, then down at the courtyard far below. The drop was at least 3 stories, perhaps more. The cobblestones of the courtyard offered no mercy, no soft landing. But behind her came the woman with the whip, and whatever had driven this child to flee onto the roof must have been more terrifying than the fall itself. That realization is perhaps the most chilling aspect of what the witnesses saw. This little girl, this child, whose whole life should have stretched out before her, chose the stones below, over whatever awaited her at Madame LaLaurie's hands. Montreuil would later say he shouted for the girl to stop, to wait. Other witnesses claimed they called out as well, their voices rising in a chorus of desperate plea. But if the child heard them, she gave no sign. Or perhaps she had moved beyond hearing, beyond reason, into that realm of pure survival instinct, where there are no good choices, only the marginally less terrible one. She jumped. For a suspended moment, witnesses reported, she seemed to hang in the air. Her thin arms reached outward as if she might take flight, as if some merciful force might catch her and carry her away from this place. Then gravity asserted its cruel inevitability. Her small body plummeted downward, tumbling past the ornate iron balconies, past the tall windows, where expensive draperies hung, past all the trappings of wealth and refinement that decorated the mansion's facade. The sound of her body striking the courtyard stones would haunt those who heard it for the rest of their lives. It was not loud. Several would remember with disturbing clarity. Not the dramatic crash that such a fall might suggest, just a sickening thud that seemed too quiet for what it represented. The ending of a young life, the brutal culmination of whatever horrors had driven her to that roof in the first place. What happened in the immediate aftermath is where accounts begin to diverge slightly, though the basic facts remain consistent. Some witnesses claimed they rushed toward the mansion's entrance, hoping against hope that the child might somehow have survived. Others said they were too shocked to move, standing paralyzed in the street as their minds struggled to accept what they had just seen. Several neighbors did confirm that they saw enslaved workers from the LaLaurie household emerge quickly into the courtyard. They moved with practiced efficiency, as though they had dealt with crises before. The child's body was lifted, and according to multiple testimonies, she showed no signs of life. No movement, no cries of pain. Fall had been instantly fatal, or near enough that it made no difference. Then came the part that galvanized the witnesses from shock into action. Rather than summoning a doctor, rather than calling for help or alerting authorities, The LaLaurie household staff carried the small body to a corner of the courtyard. They began to dig. Right there, in the courtyard of one of the finest homes in the French Quarter, they excavated a hasty grave in the bare earth. Within hours, the child who had been alive that morning, who had served breakfast perhaps, or swept floors, or performed whatever tasks had been demanded of her, was buried in an unmarked hole and covered over with dirt. This was not the behavior of people dealing with a tragic accident. This was concealment. This was the desperate attempt to hide evidence of something that could not bear scrutiny. Several neighbors, Montreal chief among them, were outraged enough to report what they had witnessed to the authorities. In a city where slavery was legal and enslaved people were considered property rather than persons under the law, it still took something truly egregious to prompt white neighbors to report a wealthy white woman. The fact that multiple witnesses came forward speaks to how disturbing they found the incident. An investigation was indeed launched. Legal records from 1833 confirmed that authorities questioned Madame LaLaurie and examined the property. They interviewed witnesses and took statements. On paper, the system was working. Justice was being pursued. But then the machinery of privilege began to turn, grinding truth into something more palatable, more convenient for those in power. Madame LaLaurie was not some powerless woman who could be easily prosecuted. She was born Marie Delphine LaLaurie, a member of one of Louisiana's most prominent Creole families. Her cousin was a territorial governor. Her family connections spiderwebbed through every level of New Orleans society. She attended the same parties as the judges, dined with the magistrates, traded gossip with their wives. The social fabric of the city's elite was tightly woven, and Madame LaLaurie sat at its very center. The investigation concluded that while the incident was regrettable, there was insufficient evidence of deliberate wrongdoing. The official position seemed to be that perhaps the child had been fleeing some justified punishment and had foolishly taken to the roof. Perhaps Madame LaLaurie had been attempting to prevent the girl from hurting herself. The whip that witnesses clearly saw could be reinterpreted, softened, explained away. Madame LaLaurie was fined. The exact amount varies in historical accounts, but it was a sum that would have meant nothing to a woman of her wealth. Pocket change. The cost of an elaborate dinner party. She was also ordered to sell 9 of her enslaved workers, presumably as punishment, and to remove any others who might have been mistreated from her care. But even this mild consequence was easily circumvented. Historical records suggest that the enslaved people were sold to relatives or friends, who then quietly sold them back to the LaLaurie household. It was a shell game, a performance of justice that changed nothing. The same people remained in the same house, under the same authority, subject to the same treatment. The neighbors who had witnessed the rooftop chase and fatal fall were left with their horror and their impotent rage. They had spoken up. They had reported what they saw. The system had acknowledged their testimony and then done virtually nothing with it. What message did this send? That wealth and social standing mattered more than a child's life. That certain people were above meaningful accountability. That witnesses could see evil in broad daylight and still be powerless to stop it. Looking back through the lens of history, this incident should have been a massive red flag. A young girl so terrified of her mistress that she chose death over capture. A hasty burial to hide evidence. Multiple witnesses reporting abuse. These were not subtle warning signs. They were glaring alarm bells that should have prompted thorough investigation and serious consequences. Instead, New Orleans society collectively shrugged. Madame LaLaurie continued to host her famous gatherings. The elite of the city continued to accept her invitations, to drink her wine, to admire her furnishings, to compliment her taste. It was easier to look away, to accept the official explanation, to avoid the uncomfortable questions that might implicate the entire social system. How many people at those parties knew about the rooftop chase? How many had heard the story from neighbors or servants? And how many simply chose not to let such unpleasantness interfere with their enjoyment of an excellent evening? These questions indict not just Madame LaLaurie, but an entire society that valued social harmony among the wealthy over justice for the powerless. The incident also raises disturbing questions about what else might have been happening inside that mansion on Royal Street. If this chase happened in broad daylight, visible to numerous witnesses, what occurred behind closed doors where no neighbors could see? What happened in the slave quarters after dark? What treatment drove a child to believe that death was preferable? These questions would not be answered for another year, not until smoke and flames would finally force open the secrets that the LaLaurie Mansion held. But they should have been asked in 1833. Young Laya's desperate flight across that roof and her fatal fall should have been enough to prompt action. Her hastily dug grave should have demanded justice. The witnesses who came forward should have been heard and believed. Instead, privilege won the day, as it so often did and so often does. The machinery of power protected its own, and a child's death became just another footnote, another uncomfortable story that polite society agreed not to discuss. The kitchen fires had been burning since before dawn that April morning in 1832, as they always did in the grand mansion on Royal Street. The enslaved cook, a woman whose name some records suggest was simply listed as property number 7 in the LaLaurie household inventory, moved through her morning routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed these same tasks thousands of times before. But on this particular day, something was different. The chain that bound her ankle to the massive cast iron stove clinked with each measured step, a sound so familiar to the household that it had become part of the mansion's daily symphony, barely noticed by those who lived in the rooms above. According to the testimonies collected in the days following the fire, this cook had been shackled to her station for weeks, perhaps months. The practice, while shocking to modern sensibilities, was not entirely uncommon in the households of wealthy Creole society, though most families took pains to ensure such arrangements remained hidden from public view. Madame Delphine LaLaurie, however, had grown increasingly bold in her treatment of the enslaved people who served her household. Neighbors had noticed. Whispers had circulated. But New Orleans society in the early 1830s operated under a strict code of discretion, where the private affairs of prominent families were not subjects for open discussion. The cook knew what awaited her. According to accounts pieced together from witnesses and from the testimonies of other enslaved people who survived that day, she had been threatened with a transfer to the attic rooms, those mysterious chambers on the 3rd floor where certain members of the household staff disappeared and were never seen working in the public spaces of the home again. Some say she had heard the sounds that filtered down through the ceiling at night. Others claim she had seen the condition of those who had been taken upstairs and later died from injuries that were explained away as accidents or the result of their own actions. What is certain is that on April 10, 1832, at some point in the mid-morning hours, the kitchen began to produce more smoke than usual. The exact sequence of events remains a matter of historical debate, but the most commonly accepted account suggests that the cook, still chained to the stove, deliberately set fire to the curtains near her workstation. Whether this was truly a suicide attempt, as some witnesses later claimed, or a desperate act meant to draw attention to the horrors occurring in the house, we may never know with absolute certainty. What we do know is that the fire spread quickly. The mansion's construction, like many homes in the French Quarter, combined old-world building techniques with materials suited to the Louisiana climate. Wood frame elements supported plastered walls, and the kitchen, though separated from the main house by a courtyard in typical Creole fashion, was connected by covered walkways that created channels for smoke and flame to travel. Within minutes, the smell of burning wood reached the main house. Within a quarter hour, flames had begun to lick at the walls of the servants' wing. Madame LaLaurie's reaction to the fire revealed much about her priorities. Rather than immediately calling for help or attempting to ensure the safety of all people in the household, she was observed by neighbors directing enslaved workers to carry furniture and valuables from the main rooms to the street. Paintings in gilded frames emerged from the front doors. Carved chairs and elaborate tables appeared on the sidewalk. A pianoforte was carefully maneuvered down the front steps. All the while, the smoke grew thicker, blacker, more ominous. It was a neighbor who summoned the fire brigade. In 1832, New Orleans relied on volunteer fire companies, civic-minded organizations that combined social club elements with the serious business of protecting the city from the flames that could devastate entire neighborhoods in a matter of hours. The fire companies arrived with their hand-pumped engines, their leather buckets, their axes and hooks. Men from across the social spectrum came running, because fire in the French Quarter threatened everyone, regardless of wealth or status. The firefighters immediately began their work, organizing bucket lines from the nearest cisterns, positioning their equipment, assessing the spread of the flames. But something troubled them. As they moved through the ground floor and into the service areas, they encountered enslaved people who seemed reluctant to speak, who flinched when asked questions, who cast fearful glances toward the upper floors of the house. Then, someone found the cook. She was still chained to the stove in the kitchen, now surrounded by flames on 3 sides. The metal shackle had grown hot enough to burn her skin. She was pulled free by firefighters who had to break the chain with their tools, and as they carried her to safety, she spoke. The accounts vary as to her exact words, but the meaning was clear and consistent across all retelling. There were people upstairs, people who could not escape, people who needed help. The firefighters turned their attention to the upper floors. They had assumed the family and household staff had evacuated. They had seen Madame LaLaurie outside, directing the removal of her possessions. They had accounted for Dr. LaLaurie and the couple's children. But now they learned there were others, people locked in rooms above, unable to flee the smoke that was already beginning to fill the upper stories. When the firefighters demanded access to all areas of the house, they encountered resistance that struck them as both unusual and deeply suspicious. Madame LaLaurie positioned herself at the base of the stairs leading to the 3rd floor. She insisted there was nothing above. She claimed the attic was empty, used only for storage, not worth risking lives to save old furniture and trunks. She grew increasingly agitated as the firefighters pressed their case, her voice rising to match the crackle of flames consuming the building around them. But the firefighters had a duty. More importantly, the crowd that had gathered in the street had heard the cook's testimony. Word spread through the onlookers with the speed that only shocking news can achieve. Citizens of New Orleans, many of whom had harbored private suspicions about the LaLaurie household for months or even years, now demanded action. They called out to the firefighters. They pushed forward. Some accounts suggest that several men from the crowd entered the mansion themselves, refusing to be turned away by the protestations of a woman who seemed more concerned with her furniture than with human lives. The confrontation at the base of the stairs grew heated. Madame LaLaurie reportedly claimed she had lost the key to the attic. She insisted that breaking down the door would cause unnecessary damage. She appealed to the firefighters' sense of property rights, reminding them of her family's standing in the community. But the smoke was growing thicker. The heat was intensifying, and the men who had come to fight the fire had no intention of leaving anyone to burn, regardless of their station or the objections of the mansion's mistress. The decision was made. A group of firefighters, accompanied by several citizens who had forced their way into the house, climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. They found the door to the attic quarters exactly as described, locked from the outside with a heavy iron lock that would have been impossible to open from within. They called out, asking if anyone was there. The response they received was not words but sounds, muffled noises that might have been attempts at speech or simply moans of distress. The firefighters raised their axes. The solid wood door, reinforced and heavy, designed to contain rather than to protect, resisted the first blows. Splinters flew. The metal lock held firm. More men joined the effort. The axes rose and fell in rhythm, each impact echoing through the mansion, mixing with the roar of the fire below and the shouts of the crowd outside. Madame LaLaurie had been restrained in a lower room, held back by men who no longer trusted her explanations or her authority. The door frame began to crack. The wood around the lock splintered and gave way. One final blow, and the door swung inward on protesting hinges, releasing a wave of heat and stench that forced the first men to step backward, covering their faces, struggling not to retch. The firefighter who led the group, a man whose name appears in some accounts as Judge Canong, stepped across the threshold. His eyes, already stinging from smoke, struggled to adjust to the dim light filtering through the attic's small barred windows. The smell that emanated from that room was unlike anything he had encountered in years of fighting fires in homes, businesses, and warehouses across the city. It was not just the smell of fire or smoke. It was something else entirely, something that spoke of suffering prolonged far beyond what any human should endure. As his vision cleared, Judge Canong saw movement in the shadows, shapes that might have been human but seemed wrong somehow, contorted, broken. He took another step into the room. Behind him, other men crowded forward, then stopped, frozen by what the firelight and the dim daylight revealed. Someone behind Judge Canong made a sound, a gasp, or a sob. Another man turned away and stumbled back toward the stairs. A third stood rooted in place, his hands gripping the door frame as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become incomprehensible. The room before them held 7 people, though people seemed an inadequate word for what they had become through months, or perhaps years of deliberate torture. What the men saw in that locked attic room would haunt them for the remainder of their lives, and would transform a house fire from a routine emergency into a scandal that would echo through the decades, cementing the LaLaurie Mansion's place in the darkest corners of New Orleans history. The fire bell rang out across New Orleans on the morning of April 10, 1832, calling citizens to a disaster that would soon reveal something far worse than flames. Smoke poured from the elegant 3-story mansion on Royal Street, the residence of Dr. Louis LaLaurie and his wife, Delphine. Neighbors rushed to help, forming bucket brigades as firefighters arrived to combat the blaze. The fire had started in the kitchen, they quickly learned, and there was something odd about the circumstances. The enslaved cook, a woman of advanced years, was found chained to the stove. She confessed immediately, without shame or fear of punishment, that she had started the fire herself. She preferred to burn, she told those who would listen, rather than face what awaited her in the attic. When bystanders asked what she meant, she simply pointed upward. The firefighters, focused on preventing the blaze from spreading to neighboring properties in the tightly packed French Quarter, paid little attention at first. But one of them, following the chain of the woman's logic and the direction of her trembling finger, found the door to the attic quarters. It was locked, bolted from the outside, sealed as if to contain something that must never be released. Madame LaLaurie appeared then, agitated and insistent. The attic was her private domain, she declared. There was nothing up there but storage, old furniture, items of no consequence. The firefighters must focus on the blaze, not waste time with locked doors. Her voice carried the imperious tone of the Creole aristocracy, accustomed to obedience from those they considered beneath them. But the cook's words had planted seeds of suspicion, and the intensity of Madame LaLaurie's objections only made those seeds grow. One firefighter pushed past her protests. Another brought tools to break the lock. The door was not simply locked but reinforced, they discovered, as if meant to withstand force from within. When the bolt finally gave way and the door swung open, those first rescuers found themselves facing a darkness that seemed to resist the light from their lanterns. The stench hit them first, a wave of human waste, rotting flesh, infected wounds, and something else, something chemical and sharp that burned in their nostrils and throats. The New Orleans Bee, in its edition published just days after the discovery, attempted to describe what the firefighters found in measured, journalistic language. But the horror leaked through every careful phrase. 7 enslaved people were discovered in that attic, the newspaper reported, in conditions that defied the imagination of decent citizens. They were found in various states of mutilation, their bodies bearing evidence of prolonged and systematic torture that had continued for months, perhaps years. Some were chained in positions that prevented them from sitting or lying down, suspended in postures of endless agony. Their muscles had atrophied, their joints locked in unnatural positions from weeks or months of immobility. The firefighters called for help. More men came up those narrow stairs, and each one emerged pale and shaking. Judge Jean-François Canonge was summoned to witness and document what had been found, to provide legal testimony that could be trusted in court. His account, recorded in official documents and reported in newspapers across the South, provided details that readers could barely stomach. One woman, he reported, had been confined in a space so small she could neither stand nor fully recline. Her spine had curved, her body twisted to fit the dimensions of her cage. When they freed her, she could not straighten, could not walk, could only crawl on hands that had worn calluses through to the bone, from supporting weight they were never meant to bear. Another victim had suffered what appeared to be crude surgical experiments. Bones in the arms and legs had been deliberately broken, then reset at grotesque angles, creating limbs that bent backward or twisted in spiral. These were not the results of beatings or accidents. They showed evidence of careful, intentional methodology. The breaks were clean, precise, and the settings showed someone had splinted the bones in their unnatural positions, ensuring they would heal incorrectly. Medical instruments were found throughout the attic, scalpels and saws, needles and thread, implements that suggested a mockery of surgical practice. One man had had his mouth sewn shut. The newspaper accounts struggled to explain this horror in language suitable for publication. Crude stitches, they reported, using what appeared to be fishing line or similar cord, had been threaded through the flesh of his lips. Infections had set in around the sutures. He had been fed, they surmised, only enough liquid sustenance to keep him alive in his silent state. How long had he endured this? Weeks? Months? His hollowed cheeks and wasted frame suggested a prolonged period of suffering. Witnesses reported seeing evidence of what they could only interpret as medical experimentation, though the purpose remained obscure and nightmarish. One woman had circular wounds on her torso, arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate placement rather than random violence. They had been treated with some caustic substance that prevented healing, keeping the wounds perpetually open and weeping. Another victim showed signs of having had parts of the scalp removed and then sewn back in different arrangements, a grotesque puzzle of human skin that served no purpose anyone could fathom except the infliction of maximum suffering. The chains themselves told stories of systematic cruelty. They were not simple restraints, but elaborate mechanisms of torment. Some victims wore iron collars, studded with inward-facing spikes, preventing them from lowering their heads to rest or sleep without driving metal points into their flesh. Others had manacles connected by chains just short enough to prevent the hands from meeting, making it impossible to eat or attend to basic needs without assistance that rarely came. The walls showed scratch marks where fingernails had worn down to nothing against unyielding brick, evidence of desperate attempts to escape or simply to mark the passage of time in that place beyond time. One elderly woman appeared to have been confined in her chains for so long that the metal had worn grooves into her bones. When physicians later examined her, they found that the shackles had actually eroded channels into the bone structure of her wrists and ankles, a testament to months or years of constant wearing without removal. Her skin had grown over parts of the iron in places, incorporating the instruments of torture into her very flesh. As word spread through the streets of New Orleans, the public reaction built from shock to horror to incandescent rage. By afternoon, a crowd had gathered outside the LaLaurie Mansion. New Orleans estimated between 2,000 and 4,000 people had assembled, their numbers growing by the hour as the stories spread through neighborhoods and across the city. These were not members of the underclass or outside agitators. These were the citizens of New Orleans, including members of the Creole aristocracy who had dined at the LaLaurie table, who had danced at her balls, who had considered her one of their own. The crowd's mood turned violent. They pressed against the building, their voices rising in a roar of condemnation. Madame LaLaurie and her husband fled through a back entrance, climbing into a carriage that sped away toward Lake Pontchartrain. Some reports suggest the crowd pursued them to the waterfront, where the Lauries boarded a ship bound for Mobile and eventually France. The mansion they left behind became the target of the mob's fury. Citizens poured through the front doors, up the stairs, destroying everything they could reach. Fine furniture was thrown from windows. Crystal and china shattered on the cobblestones below. Paintings were torn from walls and trampled underfoot. But the crowd also wanted to see. Thousands of New Orleans citizens climbed those stairs to witness the attic chamber with their own eyes. They needed to verify that the rumors spreading through the streets were not exaggerations, but terrible truth. Judge Kanong's later reports noted that as many as 4,000 people passed through the house over the following days, climbing to the attic to bear witness to what had happened there. Many emerged weeping. Some became physically ill. All left changed, their understanding of what human beings were capable of inflicting on one another permanently altered. The newspapers struggled to balance the public's hunger for information with standards of decency and the limitations of what could be printed in family publications. The New Orleans Bee published multiple articles over the following weeks, each adding details as interviews with witnesses continued, and as physicians examined the survivors. Other newspapers across the South picked up the story, reprinting accounts with varying degrees of accuracy and sensationalism. The coverage reached as far as New York and Philadelphia, shocking readers who thought they understood the nature of the South's peculiar institution, but had never imagined anything like the LaLaurie attic. The question that haunted everyone who heard the story was simple and terrible. How had this continued for so long without discovery? The LaLauries had lived on one of the most prominent streets in the French Quarter. They had entertained regularly. Servants came and went. How had no one known what was happening in those sealed upper rooms? Some whispered that there had been signs, that enslaved people had tried to escape or had been seen with suspicious injuries. One story told of a young girl who had fallen to her death from the roof while fleeing Madame LaLaurie's pursuit. But these warnings had been ignored or dismissed by a society that preferred not to look too closely at what happened behind the closed doors of wealthy homes. The survivors, those 7 souls rescued from the attic, were taken to a public building where physicians could examine and treat them. Citizens lined up to offer donations for their care, a collective act of atonement from a city that had failed to protect them. The doctors' reports made clear that many of the injuries would never fully heal. Bodies broken and reformed in unnatural configurations could not be restored to what they had been. Minds that had endured months or years of deliberate torture could not simply forget. The physical and psychological damage was permanent, a testament written in flesh and bone to what had been done in that attic chamber. As the spring of 1832 turned to summer, the LaLaurie Mansion stood empty, its windows broken, its interior destroyed by the righteous fury of the crowd. It would remain a place of horror in the memory of the city, a reminder that the most refined manners and the most elegant facades could conceal depths of cruelty that defied comprehension. The torture chamber in the attic of the LaLaurie Mansion had been opened, its secrets exposed to the light. But for the survivors, and for the city that had failed them, the darkness would never entirely lift. The fire at the LaLaurie Mansion on Royal Street had barely been extinguished when the whispers began to spread through the French Quarter like wildfire itself. Those who had helped rescue the enslaved people from the burning building could not contain what they had witnessed in that hidden attic chamber. They spoke in hushed, horrified tones of the skeletal figures chained to walls, of bodies bearing evidence of unspeakable torments, of medical instruments arranged with surgical precision beside makeshift operating tables stained dark with old blood. The stories grew more horrific with each retelling, passed from neighbor to neighbor, from tavern to street corner, from the docks to the marketplaces. By midday on that 10th of April in 1834, a crowd had begun to gather outside the mansion's iron gates, and the mood was anything but peaceful. What started as perhaps 24 outraged citizens quickly swelled to hundreds. These were not just the city's poor or downtrodden. Merchants stood alongside laborers. Well-dressed women of society mingled with washerwomen and seamstresses. The crowd represented a cross-section of New Orleans itself, united in their fury at what had been discovered behind those elegant walls. They had all passed this mansion countless times, admiring its 3-story grandeur, its wrought iron balconies dripping with ferns, its perfectly maintained facade that spoke of wealth and refinement. Many had attended the LaLaurie soirees, had danced in those ballrooms, had sipped champagne and nibbled delicacies, while just above their heads, human beings suffered in ways that defied imagination. The sense of betrayal ran deep, mixed with a collective shame that such horrors had occurred literally over their heads, while they laughed and danced below. The authorities were nowhere to be seen, or, if they were present, they were woefully outnumbered and quickly overwhelmed by the growing tide of angry humanity pressing against the mansion gates. Someone shouted that Madame LaLaurie must answer for her crimes. Another voice called for justice. Then the first stone flew through the air, shattering one of the tall windows that faced Royal Street. The sound of breaking glass seemed to break something else as well, some final restraint that had been holding the crowd back. The gates were forced open, the ornate iron twisted aside like paper, and the mob surged forward into the courtyard. What happened next would be remembered as one of the most complete destructions of private property in the city's history. The mansion that had stood as a monument to taste and elegance became the target of a rage that had been building for hours, fed by the gruesome discoveries still being made in the upper floors. The enslaved people who had been rescued were being treated by physicians, and their testimony added fuel to the fire of public outrage. They spoke of years of systematic torture, of Madame LaLaurie's cold-eyed cruelty as she inflicted pain with what seemed like scientific curiosity. They described others who had disappeared, whose bodies had been found when the debris was cleared from the attic. bearing evidence of mutilations so severe that identification was nearly impossible. The mob entered through every door, every window, every opening they could force. They swept through the grand entrance hall where Madame LaLaurie had greeted New Orleans society with gracious smiles and perfect manners. The crystal chandeliers that had cast such elegant light over those gatherings were torn from their mountings and shattered on the marble floors. Furniture that had cost fortunes was hacked apart with axes or hurled through windows into the courtyard below. In the formal dining room, where silver and china had graced tables set for elaborate meals, every dish was smashed, every piece of silverware bent and twisted. The mahogany table itself splintered under the assault of hammers and clubs. They moved through the drawing rooms where ladies had taken tea and exchanged gossip, tearing down the silk wallpaper in great strips, smashing the mirrors that had reflected the cream of New Orleans society, destroying the paintings that had adorned the walls. Every symbol of the LaLaurie wealth and status became a target. The library, with its leather-bound volumes and polished wood shelves, was gutted. Books were torn and scattered, though some reported that certain volumes were saved. Medical texts that showed anatomical drawings with handwritten notes in the margins. Notes that suggested Madame LaLaurie had been studying human anatomy with an intensity that went far beyond casual interest. The bedroom floors received special attention. Madame LaLaurie's own chambers, decorated with imported French fabrics and furnished with pieces brought from Paris, were systematically destroyed. Her wardrobe of elaborate gowns, the same dresses she had worn to charm New Orleans society, were ripped to shreds. Jewelry boxes were emptied and their contents scattered. Her personal effects were thrown into the courtyard, creating a growing pile of debris that spoke to the luxury in which she had lived, while inflicting such suffering on those in her power. Louis LaLaurie's rooms fared no better. His clothing, his personal items, everything that bore the mark of the LaLaurie name was targeted for destruction. But it was the attic, that chamber of horrors, where the enslaved people had been discovered, that drew the most visceral reaction. Even as the mob raged through the lower floors, some among them made their way up the narrow stairs to see for themselves the scene that had sparked this uprising. What they found exceeded the descriptions that had circulated through the city. The chains were still there, bolted into the walls, and stained with rust and blood. The makeshift surgical table remained, its surface bearing silent testimony to the procedures that had been performed there. Instruments lay scattered where they had been dropped by those who first discovered the room, sharp and cruel-looking implements whose purposes could only be guessed at with horror. These witnesses came back down the stairs pale and shaking, their anger if anything intensified by what they had seen. They reported that the room seemed designed for the systematic infliction of pain, that there were restraints built into the walls at various heights, that the floor was stained in patterns that suggested years of accumulated suffering. Some claimed to have found journals, notebooks filled with observations written in Madame LaLaurie's own hand, documenting her experiments with a clinical detachment that was perhaps more chilling than any expression of sadism would have been. These documents, if they truly existed, vanished in the chaos of that day and have never been recovered. Through all of this destruction, through hours of systematic demolition that reduced the interior of the mansion to a gutted shell, one question burned in the minds of the mob and the authorities alike. Where was Madame LaLaurie? Where was the woman whose cruelty had sparked this rampage? The terrible answer that gradually became clear was that she was gone. She had vanished. Witnesses later reported seeing a carriage departing from the mansion in the early afternoon, even as smoke was still rising from the fire that had been extinguished only hours before. The carriage was said to be moving at dangerous speed through the narrow streets of the French Quarter, heading toward the waterfront. Some claimed they recognized Louis LaLaurie in the driver's seat, whipping the horses forward with desperate urgency. Others swore they had caught a glimpse of Madame LaLaurie herself inside the carriage, her face hidden behind a veil, her posture erect and composed even in flight. The authorities, such as they were in those chaotic hours, attempted to give chase, but the carriage had too great a head start. By the time anyone thought to organize a proper pursuit, Madame LaLaurie had apparently reached the docks, and from there, the trail grew cold and confused. Multiple witnesses came forward in the following days and weeks, each with their own version of what had happened. A dock worker claimed to have seen a well-dressed woman and her male companion boarding a ship bound for Mobile, Alabama. They paid in gold, he said, and demanded immediate departure. The ship's captain later denied any knowledge of such passengers, but his denial was met with skepticism by those who understood that enough gold could purchase both passage and silence. From Mobile, if the reports were to be believed, the trail led to New York, though other accounts had the fugitives traveling overland to Charleston or Savannah before seeking passage across the Atlantic. The one consistent thread in most of these reports was that Madame LaLaurie's ultimate destination was Paris, the city of her ancestors, where she might disappear into the anonymity of a large European capital and live out her days beyond the reach of American justice. Over the years that followed, reported sightings of Madame LaLaurie trickled back to New Orleans like salt rubbed into an open wound. A traveler to Paris claimed to have seen her at the opera, still elegant, still poised, apparently living comfortably in a fashionable district. Another report had her living under an assumed name, but recognized by a New Orleans native who happened to be traveling in France. Yet another account placed her in a convent, having supposedly found religion in her final years, though this seemed almost cruelly ironic given the depths of her cruelty. None of these sightings were ever confirmed. None led to any action by the authorities. The French government showed no interest in extraditing an American citizen accused of crimes committed on American soil, and the complexities of international law in the 1830s made any official pursuit virtually impossible. The frustration felt by the citizens of New Orleans was profound and lasting. They had discovered evil in their midst, had torn down the mansion that housed it, had driven the perpetrator from the city, yet the woman herself had escaped any real accounting for her action. There were no trials, no formal charges, no day in court where she would be forced to face her victims and answer for what she had done. The mob's destruction of her property seemed a hollow victory when the woman herself remained free. Louis Laurie's fate was somewhat clearer, though no less frustrating to those seeking justice. Some reports had him fleeing with his wife to Europe, but other accounts suggested that the couple separated soon after their escape from New Orleans. Louis apparently returned to the United States at some point, living quietly under an assumed name until his death some years later. He never faced charges for his role in the atrocities at the Royal Street Mansion, though whether he was an active participant or simply a man who looked the other way while his wife pursued her cruel obsessions remained a matter of speculation. The LaLaurie children, scattered by the scandal, attempted to distance themselves from their mother's legacy with varying degrees of success. Some changed their names. Others moved to different cities or even different countries, trying to build lives unmarked by the infamy that had attached itself to the LaLaurie name. Their descendants, if any exist today, have kept their connection to that history carefully hidden, understanding that some associations are too dark, too shameful to ever be fully escaped. As for Madame Delphine LaLaurie herself, the most reliable report suggests that she did indeed make it to Paris and lived there until her death in 1849, approximately 15 years after her flight from New Orleans. Parish records in Paris show the death and burial of a woman matching her description and using her name, laid to rest in the St. Louis Cemetery in Paris, an ocean away from the St. Louis Cemetery in New Orleans, where many of her victims were buried. The irony of that shared name was not lost on those who learned of it. Even in death, it seemed, Madame LaLaurie had arranged to rest in comfort and respectability, while the people she tortured lay in unmarked graves or paupers' plots. The injustice of her escape, the rage of a city denied any real closure or accountability, became part of the LaLaurie legend itself. The mansion on Royal Street stood as a gutted shell for years afterward, a monument not to the elegance it once represented, but to the evil it had concealed and the justice that had been denied. The iron gates of the LaLaurie Mansion swung open again in 1835, just 1 year after Delphine's flight from New Orleans, and a new chapter began in the building's troubled existence. But something had changed in the house on Royal Street. The walls seemed to remember what they had witnessed, and soon, those who dared to call it home would discover that some sins run too deep to wash away with time. The first attempt to breathe new life into the cursed structure came when a group of educators saw potential in its spacious rooms and elegant architecture. They envisioned a school for young women, a place of learning and refinement that might redeem the mansion's tainted reputation. By the late 1830s, the halls that once echoed with the screams of the tortured now filled with the voices of students, reciting their lessons and practicing their French. The new owners invested considerable sums in renovations, scrubbing away the visible stains and attempting to erase the physical evidence of what had transpired. But they could not scrub away what lingered beneath the surface. The first incidents were subtle enough to dismiss. A teacher would enter a classroom early in the morning to find desks rearranged, though she had locked the door herself the evening before. Students complained of cold spots in certain corridors, even during the sweltering New Orleans summers when the air outside hung thick and humid. Books fell from shelves with no one near them. Doors that had been securely fastened would swing open of their own accord, revealing empty rooms beyond. Then the girls began to see things. A student named Margaret Hollings was the first to report seeing a woman in an elegant dress ascending the stairs to the attic, moving with an unnatural stillness. When Margaret called out to her, the figure simply vanished, dissolving into the shadows as if she had never existed at all. The headmistress dismissed this as an overactive imagination, the result of too many Gothic novels read by candlelight. But Margaret was not the last. Within weeks, 3 more students reported encounters with the same apparition. She was always well dressed, they said, in the style of the previous decade. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, and she moved through the house as if she still owned it, paying no attention whatsoever to the living souls who crossed her path. Some of the girls claimed they could see straight through her to the wallpaper beyond. Others swore she was as solid as any living person till the moment she vanished. The sightings grew more frequent and more disturbing. Students sleeping in the converted bedrooms on the 2nd floor woke to the sensation of hands touching their faces, though no one was there when they opened their eyes. They heard voices whispering in French, speaking words they could not quite make out, but that filled them with inexplicable dread. One girl woke screaming, claiming that a woman had been standing over her bed, staring down at her with eyes that held no warmth, no humanity at all. But the apparition of the well-dressed woman was not the only presence haunting the former LaLaurie residence. In the attic, where the most horrific discoveries had been made just years before, students and teachers alike reported hearing sounds that defied explanation. The rattling of chains echoed through the upper floors, particularly late at night when the house should have been quiet. Screams pierced the darkness, so realistic that teachers would rush upstairs convinced that a student was in mortal danger, only to find everyone sleeping peacefully in their beds. The breaking point came on a humid night in the spring of 1842. 7 students and 2 teachers reported witnessing the same terrifying scene simultaneously. They described seeing figures emerging from the walls near the old slave quarters, translucent forms of men and women, bearing the marks of unspeakable torture. Some were missing limbs. Others had faces frozen in expressions of eternal agony. The apparitions moved through the halls in a solemn procession, and witnesses claimed they could hear the sound of moaning, of crying, of prayers whispered in voices that seemed to come from another world entirely. The school closed its doors within the month. Parents refused to send their daughters back to the mansion, regardless of the education offered. The building stood empty once more, its reputation now thoroughly poisoned. No respectable institution would touch it. The house on Royal Street had become synonymous with horror, with evil that could not be exorcised. For several decades, the mansion languished in a state of semi-abandonment. Various owners attempted to rent out portions of the building, transforming it into apartments for those desperate enough or poor enough to ignore the stories. In the 1890s, a wave of Italian immigrants arrived in New Orleans seeking new lives in America. Many were willing to accept cheap housing wherever they could find it, and the LaLaurie Mansion offered rooms at prices that reflected its dark reputation. But the immigrants did not stay long. A family named Giacomo moved into a 3rd-floor apartment in 1893, hoping to establish themselves in their new country. Within 2 weeks, they fled in terror. Paolo Giacomo told anyone who would listen about the night he woke to find a woman standing in the corner of his bedroom, watching him and his wife sleep. When he lit a candle, she was gone. But she returned the next night, and the night after that. His wife reported being touched by invisible hands while she cooked. Their children refused to sleep in their own room, claiming that someone whispered to them in the darkness, speaking in a language they did not understand. The Giacomos were not alone in their experiences. Other Italian families living in the building reported similar phenomena. Tools disappeared and reappeared in impossible locations. Locked doors opened themselves. the sound of footsteps paced overhead when no one occupied the rooms above. And always, there were the screams emanating from the attic, the rattle of chains, the sense of overwhelming dread that seemed to permeate the very air. One tenant, a man named Antonio Russo, claimed he saw the most disturbing apparition of all. He was working late in his ground-floor apartment when he heard a commotion in the courtyard. Looking out his window, he witnessed what he described as a reenactment of some past horror. He saw a young girl, transparent and glowing with an eerie light, running across the courtyard as if fleeing from something terrible. She was being pursued by the well-dressed woman, the same figure so many others had reported. According to Russo, the girl reached the edge of the roof and, rather than face her pursuer, threw herself over the side. He claimed he could hear the impact of her body hitting the ground, though when he rushed outside, there was nothing there. This account was particularly chilling because it seemed to align with stories that had circulated about the LaLaurie household before its dark secrets were exposed. Witnesses from the 1830s had reported seeing a young slave girl fall from the roof while trying to escape Madame LaLaurie's wrath. Now, decades later, the scene appeared to be replaying itself for those unfortunate enough to witness it. By the turn of the 20th century, the mansion had deteriorated into a slum. The elegant finishes were crumbling. The once grand rooms were subdivided into cramped, poorly maintained apartments. The building housed the desperately poor, those who had no other options. And still, the reports continued. A worker performing repairs in 1908 claimed that he was physically pushed by invisible hands while working in the attic, nearly causing him to fall through a weakened section of floor. A woman living on the second floor in 1915 reported that her furniture rearranged itself during the night, with heavy pieces moved to different locations while she slept. Throughout the 20th century, the mansion cycled through various owners and purposes. For a time, it served as a bar and then as a furniture store. Each business eventually failed. Employees working in the building reported the same phenomena that had plagued residents for decades. They heard screams when no one else was in the building. They saw the apparition of the well-dressed woman, always elegant, always silent, always disappearing when approached. They felt watched, felt unwelcome, felt the oppressive weight of the building's history pressing down on them. One bartender working in the establishment during the 1950s told a local newspaper that he would arrive early in the morning to find every bottle behind the bar removed from its shelf and placed on the floor, despite having locked the premises securely the night before. Another employee claimed she saw a man in chains standing in the corner of the storage room, his face contorted in pain. When she blinked, he was gone. The mansion's notoriety grew over the decades, fed by sensational newspaper accounts and local legends passed down through generations. Tour guides began including it on their routes through the French Quarter, pointing out the building where Madame LaLaurie had committed her atrocities. Tourists would photograph the exterior, unaware that inside, the current occupants were experiencing their own encounters with whatever lingered in those cursed halls. In 2007, the mansion gained a new owner who brought international attention to the property. Academy Award-winning actor Nicolas Cage, known for his eclectic real estate purchases and fascination with the unusual, bought the LaLaurie Mansion for over $3 million. Cage, a New Orleans native with a deep affection for his hometown, reportedly saw the purchase as an investment in the city's historical architecture. Some speculated that his interest in the paranormal, evidenced by his collection of unusual artifacts and properties, played a role in his decision. But Cage's ownership was short-lived. The financial crisis of 2008 hit the actor hard, and by 2009, the mansion was in foreclosure. He lost the property without ever having significantly occupied it. Some local residents whispered that the house had rejected him, that the spirits within would not allow anyone to claim dominion over their domain for long. Whether this was supernatural intervention or simple economics, the result was the same. The mansion changed hands once again. Modern paranormal investigation teams have made the LaLaurie Mansion a priority destination, though gaining access has proven difficult. The building remains a private residence, and its owners have generally been reluctant to allow ghost hunters inside. However, some investigations have taken place over the years, and the findings have been consistent with the historical accounts. Investigators report unusual electromagnetic field readings throughout the building, particularly concentrated in the attic area where the tortured slaves were discovered. Audio recordings have captured what sound like voices speaking in French, footsteps on empty staircases, and the distinctive sound of metal chains dragging across wooden floors. Thermal imaging has revealed cold spots that seem to move through rooms with purposeful intent, as if intelligent entities are controlling them. Several investigators have reported feeling physically unwell while inside the mansion. They describe sudden onset of nausea, dizziness, and overwhelming feelings of sadness and despair. One team member became so distressed during an investigation that her colleagues had to remove her from the building immediately. She later stated that she felt as though she was experiencing someone else's pain, that the suffering embedded in the walls had somehow transferred itself to her consciousness. The apparition of the well-dressed woman continues to be reported by those who work in or near the building. Maintenance workers, delivery personnel, and neighbors have all described seeing her figure in windows or walking through rooms visible from the street. She is always described the same way, elegant and poised, moving with the confidence of someone in their own home. Most witnesses say she appears completely solid until the moment she vanishes, making it impossible to know she is not a living person until she disappears before their eyes. Today, the LaLaurie Mansion stands as a private residence once more, its current owners maintaining their privacy behind the restored facade. The building has been renovated multiple times over the decades, but no amount of reconstruction has silenced the stories that continue to emerge from within its walls. The house on Royal Street remains one of the most haunted locations in America, a monument to the depths of human cruelty and the possibility that some evils echo through time, never truly dying, never truly leaving the places where they were born. The archives hold documents. The newspapers from 1834 still exist. Court records, property transfers, witness testimonies, they all survive in climate-controlled vaults beneath Jackson Square. Yet somehow, despite all this evidence, despite the documented horror of what happened at 1140 Royal Street, the questions keep multiplying. The more we discover, the less certain we become. Start with the most basic mystery. What happened to Delphine LaLaurie herself? The historical record tells us she fled New Orleans on a schooner bound for Mobile, then made her way to Paris where she lived out her remaining years among French society. Her death certificate exists in Parisian archives, dated December 7, 1849. She was supposedly buried in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, though that grave has never been conclusively identified. But is any of that actually true? Because there are other stories. Persistent rumors that circulated through New Orleans for decades after the fire. Some claimed Madame LaLaurie never left Louisiana at all, that she returned within months of her escape, living under an assumed name in a house on the outskirts of the French Quarter. That she changed her appearance, dyed her hair, adopted the identity of a widow from Mobile. There were reported sightings well into the 1850s. A woman matching her description at the French market. Someone who looked remarkably like her attending Mass at a small chapel in Algiers Point. Were these just cases of mistaken identity? The kind of phantom sightings that follow any notorious figure? Or did Delphine LaLaurie hide in plain sight, protected by wealth and connections, continuing her life mere blocks from the scene of her exposed crimes? The debate extends beyond her ultimate fate. Historians cannot agree on the fundamental question of the atrocities themselves. Some researchers argue the newspaper accounts were sensationalized, that the New Orleans Bee and other publications exaggerated the conditions in the slave quarters to sell papers, to create sensation, to fuel the already combustible tensions around slavery. They point to the lack of official death certificates, the absence of identified victims, the way stories grew more elaborate with each retelling. They suggest perhaps there were a few instances of abuse, certainly inexcusable, but not the systematic torture chamber described in the most lurid accounts. But then there are the other historians, the ones who have dug deeper into parish records, cross-referenced property documents, traced the disappearances. They argue the truth was almost certainly worse than what was reported, because think about what we do know was documented. The enslaved woman who jumped from the roof to escape punishment, witnessed by multiple neighbors. The bodies found chained in the attic, verified by dozens of people who walked through that house in the hours after the fire. These are not folklore. These are documented facts with named witnesses and contemporary accounts. If this is what was visible in a single morning, what happened in the years before? What occurred in that house when there were no witnesses, no fires forcing open locked doors? This is where the mathematics of horror become almost unbearable to consider. Madame LaLaurie owned that house for how many years? Records show she purchased the property in 1831, but she may have lived there earlier. Let us say, conservatively, 3 years. In that time, how many enslaved people passed through her ownership? Property records are incomplete, but we know she bought and sold people regularly. At least 30 different individuals can be traced through fragmentary documents. But 30 seems impossibly low given the wealth of the household and the turnover rate. 50? 75? And what happened to those who simply vanished from the records? In a system where human beings were property, where detailed inventories were kept of horses and furniture, but people could disappear without paperwork, how many victims could there truly have been? The neighbors claimed to have noticed people arriving at the LaLaurie Mansion but never leaving. After the fire, some came forward saying they had wondered for months about the decreasing number of people they saw in the courtyard, in the windows. But they had not asked questions, had not investigated. Because in 1830s New Orleans, what happened behind the walls of a wealthy white household was not subject to scrutiny. The social mechanisms that might have protected the vulnerable simply did not exist for enslaved people in the home of someone like Delphine LaLaurie. Then there is the even darker possibility, the one some researchers whisper about but rarely commit to print. What if the house on Royal Street was not unique? What if the only unusual thing about Madame LaLaurie was that she got caught? In a society built on the legal ownership of human beings, in a system that gave absolute power to some over others, how many other houses held similar secrets? How many other attics concealed similar horrors? The LaLaurie Mansion became famous because a fire exposed it. But fires do not break out everywhere. Locked doors do not always open. Some modern writers and tour guides have attempted to rehabilitate Delphine LaLaurie's reputation, or at least to soften it. They frame her as a product of her time, suggest the stories are exaggerated folklore, claim we cannot judge historical figures by modern standards. But this minimization ignores something crucial. Madame LaLaurie was found horrifying by the standards of her own era. Her peers, people who themselves lived in a slave-owning society, were so appalled by what they discovered that they formed a mob and destroyed her house. The people of 1834 New Orleans, not 21st century observers, deemed her actions monstrous. When your own contemporaries find you beyond the pale, you do not get to hide behind historical context. The forensic questions remain open. Modern researchers have occasionally proposed excavating the property, using ground-penetrating radar, searching for remains. But 1140 Royal Street is private property, has been continuously occupied, and no owner has permitted such investigation. The courtyard has been paved over multiple times, the foundations reinforced and rebuilt. If there were bodies buried on the property, they lie beneath generations of construction. The house keeps its secrets, and the house does still stand. This is perhaps the most unsettling fact of all. Drive down Royal Street today and you will pass it. Tourists photograph it daily, often not knowing its history. It has been a music conservatory, a bar, luxury apartments. People have lived in those rooms, slept in spaces where enslaved people were tortured, walked across floors that once ran with blood. Does that change a place permanently? Can a building be cleansed of such history, or does it soak into the walls like humidity? Those who work in historic preservation in New Orleans will tell you certain buildings feel different. Not all old structures carry the same weight. Most become neutral with time, their histories fading into background. But a very few, retain something. An atmosphere that persists regardless of renovation or blessing or time. 1140 Royal Street is consistently described this way, even by people who know nothing of its past. A heaviness in the air, rooms that stay cold regardless of season, a sense of presence that never quite dissipates. Perhaps some horrors are so profound they alter physical space. Perhaps extreme suffering and cruelty leave markers we do not yet have instruments to measure. Or perhaps the lingering darkness we sense in certain places is just our own psychological projection, our knowledge of history creating feelings where none objectively exist. Either way, the result is the same. The house stands. The walls remain. And whatever happened in that attic during those years before the fire, whatever truths died with unnamed victims, those secrets are sealed in plaster and brick and timber that refuse to fully yield their testimony. The questions will not be answered. Madame LaLaurie's true fate remains uncertain. The real number of victims will never be known. The full extent of what occurred behind those shuttered windows is lost to time and deliberate obscurity. We are left only with fragments, with hints, with the documented minimum that must have happened, and the terrifying possibility of so much more. The archives can take us only so far. Beyond their reach lies darkness that may be permanent. And in that darkness, in those unanswered questions, the horror somehow deepens. Because the known is terrible enough. The unknown is limitless. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.